Hey guys, it's Sagar, and in this video, we are going to take a very detailed look at all the cameras on this Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus. I know many of you have been waiting for this video, and frankly, I was also very excited to try out this 200 megapixel camera and see if it is really as good as Redmi claims it to be. Now I have over 90 image and video samples for this video, so without wasting any more time, let us take a brief look at all the cameras that we are working with and then head straight to the image and video samples. There are 3 cameras in this metallic camera module, and the main showstopper is this 200 megapixel Samsung HPX sensor with f1.7 aperture, 24mm lens and optical image stabilization. This is the one that we are going to focus the most on, as the main camera is the one which most of the people take majority of their images with. The next camera gets an 8 megapixel Sony IMX355 sensor with f2.2 aperture and an ultra-wide angle lens with 120° field of view. And finally, there is a 2 megapixel macro camera with f2.4 aperture. At the front, we get a 16 megapixel camera with f2.5 aperture. With that out of the way, let us start with the images, starting with the bright daytime ones from the main camera. These are from the 200 megapixel sensor, but they are pixel binned 12 megapixel ones, and we will check out the full resolution 200 megapixel images a bit later on. No, wait. You know what? The 200 megapixel camera is what you guys are here for. So this time I am going to change the format a bit, and we will first look at the 200 megapixel shots from this Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus. Here's a good looking, very well lit 200 megapixel shot. I mentioned well lit because it is very important to get a lot of light in these 200 megapixel images, else there will be a lot of noise in them since each individual pixel is very small and can only capture a limited amount of light. Alright, coming back to the shot. As you can see, it is incredibly detailed. Here is a 12 megapixel binned shot next to it for comparison. You won't actually see any difference unless you zoom in, so here's a 300% zoomed in view of both the images. Still can't see any noticeable difference. Here's a 600% zoomed in view, and now you start noticing the extra bit of details in the 200 megapixel shot. Here is another set of images, and this one has even more sunlight hitting the building, and again you won't notice any difference between these two unless you zoom in 6 to 7 times. But once you do, the 200 megapixel ones are much sharper and have retained almost every detail of the scene, whereas the 12 megapixel one starts to look like a pixelated mess when zoomed in so far. Now these 12 megapixel shots are formed by combining the information from 16 pixels into one, thus reducing the size of the entire shot. But since it's a 200 megapixel sensor, the traditional 4:1 binning is also possible, and thanks to this, the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus lets you take 50 megapixel images as well. Here are the 12, 50 and 200 megapixel shots stacked next to each other. As expected, the 50 megapixel shot shows more details than the 12 megapixel ones, but a bit less than the 200 megapixel ones. So yes, the 200 megapixel shots have the most amount of details, and rightly so. But to see an even slightest difference between the 12 and 200 megapixel shot, you will have to zoom in anywhere between 5 to 7 times, and even more if you need to see a difference between the 50 and 200 megapixel image. Now think about this, that when was the last time you zoomed in so far in one of your images? I am sure that most of you don't zoom in on your images this far very often. So I honestly feel that taking 200 megapixel shots is nothing but a waste of storage space on your phone, because the 200 megapixel image is 10 times larger in terms of file size than a 12 megapixel one. If you zoom in far enough, there is a clear difference between the 12 and 200 megapixel shots, but not so much between the 50 and 200 megapixel ones. So I personally feel that if you want to have more details in your shots, like when you are trying to capture some landscape or architecture, it is better to switch to the 50 megapixel mode rather than the 200 megapixel one. Let us do a blind test. Here's a 50 and 200 megapixel shot next to each other. I have zoomed in 600% on both these images. Can you easily tell which is which? Take your time. I will move around to a different part of the image to see if we could spot more details in one of these images. Unless you have some superhuman vision, I am sure most of you saw no difference between these two sets of images. By the way, the one on the right is the 50 megapixel one, and the one on the left was the 200 megapixel one. I am not saying that 200 megapixel images are bad, but if you could not see any huge difference even after zooming in so far, isn't it better to just stick to the 50 megapixel images, which are 4 times smaller in terms of file size? Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Alright, all the shots from the main image sensor from this point onwards will be pixel binned 12 megapixel ones. Like with most of the phones, we get amazing looking shots during the daytime. This phone's processing tries to lift the shadows a bit, which reduces the contrast and makes some of the areas in few of these shots appear a bit faded or flat. But for the most part, I like how these images turned out. The shutter speed is also pretty fast, so I did not feel any lag while clicking these images. These indoor daytime shots also turned out to be very sharp and detailed. We also don't see too much noise in the darker parts, which is always a good sign, and even as I zoom in, these images seem to have captured a lot of details. The colors in these images look good for the most part. They are not too saturated, which is nice, and they are very close to how the scene looked in real life. There is, however, a slight less warmth to these images. It was a nice sunny day, and most of the shots were clicked during the noon time, and that warmth is not represented in these shots. I feel like the camera tries to cool the color temperature down a bit. That being said, these colors don't look bad at all. While taking your images, you have the option to turn the HDR mode on or off, or at least that is what I thought. By default, the HDR mode is turned off, so I went on and turned it on. But as it turns out, pressing this button puts the phone in auto HDR mode, and the HDR mode is on only when the HDR text is yellow, which it should have been for this scene. But for some reason, the phone thought it doesn't need to turn the HDR mode on, and the resulting image has dark shadows and overblown sun. I would have really liked to have a button to force the HDR mode when we are in these situations. Okay, for some of the other shots the HDR mode did come up, and here are the results. The image is lit very evenly. There is no underexposed shadow or overblown sky in the shot. Well, other than the sun in the top left corner, but I like how well this shot is lit. Same with this one. The sun was just peeking out from behind the leaves, but the phone did really well to capture a lot of details and colors in the shadows all around, while not letting the sun to completely blow out the blue sky at the same time. Things are a bit different when you have faces or people in the shot. The phone tries to prioritize the face to be lit well, so it bumps up the exposure of the entire shot, which makes it look completely faded and too processed. I tried to manually tap on the face and adjust the exposure for this shot to look less faded, but then the face got really dark. So if you have people in your shot, don't make them stand against a bright background, or else the image will be completely blown out and flat. I love to get up close to my subjects for taking close-up shots, and thankfully, the main camera is really fast and accurate at setting the focus on a nearby object. Despite of being a huge 200 megapixel sensor, the minimum focusing distance is really good. I mean, I don't have to be too far away from the subject like with some of the other phones which I have. With this one, I can be less than a feet away from the subject and it will still set the focus. As you can see, the subject of the shot is in perfect focus and the background gets a very natural and nice looking optical bokeh thanks to the big sensor and wide aperture. If you like to get even closer, then there is a macro lens which will let you get as close as 4 cm to the subject. That being said, these are 2 megapixel macro shots and I honestly feel they look horrible. Instead of these kind of shots, it would have been better if this phone came with just 2 cameras, normal and ultra wide one. Because I'm sure no one is going to use this macro camera for taking any worthwhile images. Speaking of the wide camera, here is how much more of the scene it will let you get in the shot compared to the normal one. This is not the widest one that I have seen, but at 120° field of view, it still lets in a lot more of the scene compared to the 24mm lens on the main camera. This lens lets us give a perspective to things and also let us show their scale. It is however just an 8 megapixel sensor, so there aren't as many details in these wide shots as the ones from the main image sensor. But if you give it enough light, it will let you take some really good and usable images. There is a bit of distortion and artifacting towards the edges of these wide shots, but there is lens correction being applied in the background, so all of the lines in these wide shots appear to be straight, even for the objects which are at the edge of the frame. With that, we come to the portrait shots. I really enjoy taking portrait shots, and I think this is the easiest way to separate your images from the normal ones and make them look a bit more special or professional. Well, that is if the phone does a good job with these shots. As you can probably tell, the subject in these shots look really good and sharp, and it does very well with the skin tones as well, which is one of the hardest parts to get right. But if I zoom in on these portrait shots, you will notice that the edge detection is not perfect in some of the shots, while in others, there is a very hard line separating the subject from the background. In some of the shots, it even feels like we have just placed a cutout of the person in front of a green screen and just projected some scenes on it. I feel like the subjects in these shots look really good, so if Redmi could work a bit on getting the blur roll-off look more natural, then these portrait shots could look very good. While they are at it, they might as well work on getting the dynamic range right, because if there is a bright area behind your subject in these portrait shots, it is almost always going to be blown out like in this picture. The dynamic range in these portrait shots is all messed up. The phone is very quick at detecting the edges and separating the subject from the background, so you don't have to point the phone towards your subject for a long time. If only the edge detection was a lot more refined. This is something which can get better with updates, and I have actually seen Redmi work on it in the past, so hopefully they will be working on making the portrait shots look much better from this phone as well. Normally when I take portraits of objects, the edge detection gets better on most of the phones because with most of the objects, there is a hard line separating them from the background anyways. But even with that being the case, the portraits of objects on this Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus are just not as good. Frankly, I have seen phones priced much lower than this take better looking portrait shots. Actually, Redmi's own phones which cost lower than this take better looking portrait shots, so I really hope Redmi is working on fixing the portrait mode on this phone. With that, let us move on to the artificial and low light shots. I feel like most mid-budget smartphones these days, like the one we are talking about in this video, has got really good at taking images in artificial lighting conditions, especially when it is a very well-lit environment like we see in these shots. This Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus, however, gets OIS on its main camera, so along with a big image sensor which gathers a lot of light and wide aperture which lets in even more light on the said sensor, the shutter can now also remain open for a few extra milliseconds to let in even more light on the sensor so the images look this good. Once you get to lower lighting situations, the shutter speed gets a bit longer, so try not to move your phone vigorously once you press the shutter button. OIS can compensate for small handshakes, but not for vigorous shaking, so keep that in mind. As we get to even lower light, these images still look pretty good. If you zoom in, they might not look as sharp as they did during the daytime, but if you don't zoom in a lot, they still look pretty good. There is a bit of noise which starts to come up in the darker parts of these images. Redmi made a big fuss in their keynote presentation about the lens flare and the ghosting reflections in images from other phones, and how they have used some special expensive coating on their lenses which helps them get rid of this. Well, to be honest, that coating doesn't seem to be working all that well. As you can see, there is this long flare across the shot. I don't even know which light was causing it because I don't see any light source in the shot. Not just in these low light situations, we see this in daytime images as well. In this shot, we can see some of the ghosting flares from this LED light and even the flares on the light source itself. I have a lot of other images too where the lights are clearly seen, so yeah, the coating that they have been talking about in the launch event is not eliminating these flares. It may be reducing them to some extent but not getting rid of them, just wanted to make this clear. Alright, so once the light gets even lower, you can either switch to the night mode manually or have the auto night mode turned on from within the camera settings. This shot without the night mode doesn't look all that bad, but look at the one with it turned on. It looks so much sharper and more detailed. There is clearly a lot of sharpening being applied when you switch to the night mode, which makes these images look overprocessed to me. But if you're someone who doesn't mind this look, then you will like the night mode shots on the main camera of this phone. By adding extra sharpness to these shots, night mode also enhances the noise in some of these images. And unlike what it did during the daytime, for some reason, the night mode on this phone makes the lights appear a lot warmer than they were in real life. You can see this very clearly in this set of images. There was plenty of light, so I did not necessarily have to shift to the night mode. But I did it anyways to show how this night mode messes up the colors. You can clearly see image with the night mode being so much warmer than the one without it. I also feel like the night mode takes a few seconds too long to capture the image. And I know for a fact that most people in real life don't have the patience to hold their phone steady for so long. I mean, other than a few people who are enthusiasts. I myself don't like to take images in lower light if the phone is shooting in night mode, so I can understand other people not wanting to wait either. So even though the images from night mode might look more detailed, I, like most of the other people, don't really like to use it all that often on my phone. The wide lens gets an 8 megapixel sensor and a narrow aperture, so it is not the best at capturing a lot of details in these lighting conditions. But if you want, you can still use it, and if you have a steady pair of hands, turn on the night mode and those shots will actually look somewhat better. Again, personally, I never used this lens when the light got this low. With that, we come to the final camera on this phone, the front-facing camera. It's a 16 megapixel sensor, and as you can probably tell, it applies a lot of sharpening to these selfies. The beauty mode is on by default, so make sure to turn it off if you don't like it. This camera for some reason doesn't handle the skin tones all that well and makes them look too pale. The other colors in these shots also appear to be less saturated than how they were in real life. It is not the worst selfie shooter though. The dynamic range in these selfies is really good, but for that to work, you will have to remember to turn the HDR mode on every time you switch to the front-facing camera. Sometimes even with it turned on, few parts of the images might be blown out if the light around you is too bright. When you move to taking portrait selfies, again make sure to turn off the beauty or skin smoothing mode as it is turned on by default. I feel like the edge detection from this selfie camera is slightly better than the rear-facing camera, and you won't see hard lines separating the subjects from the background, which makes these ones look a bit more natural. The dynamic range, however, takes a big hit while taking portrait selfies, and the HDR mode doesn't even work here. So if you have a brighter area behind you while taking portrait selfies like in this shot, it will be completely blown out. Here's a video from the front-facing camera of the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus. You can see how it handles the overall colors of the scene, exposure, and stabilization when I'm walking around with it. It can shoot at a maximum resolution of 1080p 60 fps, but this video I'm recording at 1080p 30 fps. You can shoot videos at a maximum resolution of 4K 30 fps. These don't get electronic stabilization, but because there is OIS, these videos don't look horribly shaky. If you hold the phone steady and walk with light steps, these videos end up looking really good and usable. I'm in the 4K 30 fps video mode now, And you can see the main image sensor moving around when I shake the phone. That is optical image stabilization at work. It works for 1080p and 720p 30fps videos as well, but for some reason, optical image stabilization doesn't work when I switch to 1080p 60fps video mode. You will have to drop the resolution to 1080p 30fps for the electronic stabilization to kick in. But then you lose out on lot of details and crispiness of the 4K resolution. This might not be the best phone to shoot vlogs with, but it is definitely doing a better job while shooting videos than from some of the other phones in this price range like the Realme 10 Pro Plus. So with that, we have seen 100 image and video samples from all the cameras on this phone, and other than the macro shooter, I would say all others are doing a good enough job, especially the main 200 megapixel one. I think the main camera is what majority of the people end up using most often, and it takes really good images during the daytime. It produces good looking colors, close-up shots look really good, and when the HDR mode kicks in, those images look pretty good as well. Yes, the portrait mode needs a bit of work, and the edge detection needs to get a lot more natural. Indoor images look excellent for a phone in this price range, and the low light shots by itself also do a very good job. I would say by itself, the cameras on this Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus are doing an excellent job, but how it performs against the competition is a whole another question. To find out the answer, I'll be comparing these cameras with the ones on its younger brother, the Redmi Note 12 Pro, Realme 10 Pro Plus, and even with the ones on the iPhone 14 Pro, because Redmi themselves opened the door for this comparison when they talked about these two phones in their launch event. These are going to be very interesting comparisons, so make sure you have the notifications for this channel turned on. That is it for this video guys. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video and subscribe to the channel for a lot more quality tech videos like this. You can also check out some of the other videos from this channel. This has been Sagar, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.